Born in 1724, Dai Zhen, whose courtesy name was Dai Dongyuan, was the son of a cloth merchant in the town of Longfu in Xiuning County, Huizhou Prefecture in Anhui Province. As we know, in the 18th century, Huizhou was a highly developed area, economically as well as culturally. The tea and cotton trade flourished, and many young people from the area became famous scholars, writers, and artists. In his youth, Dai Zhen studied for some time with the famous scholar Jiang Yong. Jiang Yong had come into contact with the work of Mei Wending, the famous mathematician and astronomer, who was familiar with Western learning in these fields as introduced by Matteo Ricci, Xu Guangqi, and others. In addition to phonology and the classic Li Ji, we know that Dai Zhen studied mathematics with Jiang Yong, and we have reason to believe that Jiang Yong transmitted knowledge of Western geometry to Dai Zhen that became important for his general intellectual development. In the mid-1750s, Dai Zhen had to leave Huizhou as a result of a family feud, and during the following 20 years he led a vagrant life. He first went to Beijing, where he supported himself as a private tutor, first in the home of Ji Yun, who later became the chief editor of the Siku Quanshu project, and then in the home of Wang Anguo, whose son, Wang Niansun, was to become one of China's foremost philologists. Maybe not all of you are familiar with the Siku Quanshu project. This was an enormous project undertaken by the Qianlong Emperor to publish all valuable texts that could be found. It was also a project to get rid of dangerous texts that I shouldn't say in the spirit of PJ, but the day before yesterday, PJ was saying that we must dare to criticize things. In the 18th century, part of this Siku Quanshu project was to get rid of so-called harmful texts. But it was an enormous project. They copied 3,461 different titles into one set, into several sets. This is what this anthology is. And with modern digital technology, somebody has counted the number of characters. Do you know how many characters there are in the Siku Quanshu? Altogether, 800 million characters. 800 million characters. We are very proud to have a set in Stockholm. I'm sure there are many in Hong Kong. Thus, during his years in Beijing, Dai Zhen got to know several luminaries in the intellectual world. In addition to those already mentioned, for example, Lu Wenchao, Qian Daxin, and Zhu Yun. Towards the end of the 1750s, Dai Zhen moved to Yangzhou, at that time one of the economic and cultural centers in the country, where for a few years and well into the 1760s, he worked as a private tutor in the home of Lu Jianzheng, and where he also got to know the famous textual critic Hui Dong. In the 1760s, Dai Zhen again spent some time in Beijing, where he gave lectures that attracted considerable attention. Among his listeners was the famous philologist and phonologist Duan Yucai, who was so impressed that he declared himself to be Dai Zhen's pupil. After Dai Zhen's death, Duan Yucai wrote a biography of his master that still remains our most important source of information about Dai Zhen's life. In the 1750s and 60s, Dai Zhen passed the exams for the Xiuzai and Juran degrees in the imperial examinations. After failing, however, on 6 occasions to pass the exam for the Jinshi degree, he was awarded this degree in 1775 by an imperial decree of the Qianlong Emperor, who also appointed him a member of the prestigious Hanlin Academy. But it is an interesting fact that Dai Zhen failed on 6 occasions to pass the Jinshi degree exam. In the late 1760s and early 70s, Dai Zhen visited the provinces of Zhili and Shanxi. He was invited to Zhili to help work on the canal system in the province, and in Shanxi he took part in the work on 2 local gazetteers, 2 Difangzhi, one on Fenzhou Prefecture and one on Fenyang County, Sandianshui and Fen. In the summer of 1773, he had a meeting with Zhang Xuecheng, one of the most interesting scholars of the time, whom he had probably first met in Ningbo earlier, perhaps in 1766. Their diverging intellectual inclinations found expression in diametrically opposed perspectives of what we would call the vicious circle of hermeneutics. Zhen argued emphatically that one must start with the smallest unit, the written character, and then proceed upwards in order to finally grasp Dao, the way. Whereas Zhang Xuecheng insisted that in order to understand the individual facts, one must first have a grasp of the whole. In the autumn of 1773, Zhen returned to Beijing to take up work as a compiler within the Siku Quanshu project. That is this big anthology I just talked about. He remained in Beijing until his death in the summer of 1777. Now a few brief words about Zhen's time, the Qianlong era. As you may recall, back in 1313, the Mongol rulers of the Yuan dynasty had decreed that the civil service examinations should henceforth be based on Li Xue, that is the main current of Neo-Confucian thought as formulated by the great Zhu in the Song dynasty, Zhu who lived from 1130 to 1200. From then on, Li Xue served as an ideological orthodoxy in China, albeit more or less compelling, until the early 20th century, and it was on the Li Xue orthodoxy that Zhen focused his critique of Neo-Confucianism. Although Zhen was in fact philosophically even more critical of Xinxue, the school of mind, that is the other main branch of Neo-Confucianism, which, as we know, was based primarily on the teachings of Wang Yangming and Lu Xiangshan. In Zhen's time, that is the Qianlong era, Li Xue was not rigorously upheld as an ideological orthodoxy outside the realm of the examination system. In fact, the intellectual luminaries of the day were generally quite critical of Zhu. This was the era of Hanxue and textual criticism, and the leading scholars found Zhu's interpretations of the classics too speculative, and so they went back to the early Han Dynasty commentaries in search of textually more sound interpretations. In a way, the position of the Li Xue orthodoxy in the Qianlong era maybe resembled the position of the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy in our time. Just as most intellectuals and officials in China today do not take Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, very seriously intellectually. So, in Zhen's time, most leading scholars disliked Zhu's Li Xue. There seems even to be reason to believe that the Qianlong emperor himself shared the predilection for textual criticism and was critical of Li Xue. This is something that Lu Xun once suggested. Do you know that? Just as Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, is still upheld mainly to legitimize the rule of the Communist Party, so in Zhen's time, Li Xue seems to have been upheld as orthodoxy in order to maintain the legitimacy of dynastic rule, rather than because of intellectual convictions. The intellectual climate in Zhen's time was characterized by an interest in philology rather than philosophy, and during this time philological and phonological studies took several important steps forward. Scholars such as Duan Yucai, Wang Niansun, Qian Daxin and others produced works of enduring value. Indeed, Zhen himself was a prominent representative of Hanxue. In his lifetime, he was not really well known for his philosophical ideas, but rather for his studies of ancient texts and his insights into the phonology of the ancient Chinese language, and to some extent also for his essays on mathematics. He differed, however, from the mainstream of Hanxue scholars by going beyond philology and into the realm of thought and philosophy. He seems to have been rather cautious in presenting his philosophical views, maybe because they so openly challenged the Li Xue orthodoxy, and did so in a way that could also be understood to imply critique of the dynastic rule. This is to recapitulate a little bit. Just a few brief words.